The elevator doors had barely closed on the 22nd floor when Ryan Bennett realized he had said something he could not take back. He was still holding a stack of blueprints against his chest, his tie loosened after 4 hours of budget negotiations, and the words had slipped out before his brain caught up with his mouth. Claire Whitfield stood 2 feet away from him, her arms crossed over a charcoal blazer, her expression unreadable, the way it always was in front of other people. "Careful," he had said, glancing at the 3 junior engineers crowded behind them in the conference room doorway. "People will think we're dating." He meant it as a joke, the kind of throwaway line coworkers tossed around after a long meeting, a release valve for the tension of watching a multi-million-dollar renovation budget get torn apart, clause by clause. He expected a raised eyebrow, maybe a dry laugh, maybe nothing at all. What he did not expect was for Claire to tilt her head, hold his gaze for a beat longer than professional distance allowed, and say with a small, deliberate smile, "I hope they do." The room went silent. Somewhere near the back, a phone camera that had been recording the tail end of the meeting for the internal newsletter kept rolling, capturing every second of it. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Amanda from HR froze with her tablet halfway raised. One of the interns actually dropped his pen. Ryan felt heat crawl up the back of his neck, the specific heat of a man who has just said something reckless to the most powerful woman in the building and gotten an answer he had no idea how to file away. Claire Whitfield was not a woman who joked. In 4 years at Whitfield Harbor Development, Ryan had seen her dismantle a hostile takeover bid in 11 minutes without raising her voice, and he had seen her fire a senior vice president for padding expense reports without so much as a change in her tone. She was precise. She was contained. She did not flirt with structural engineers in front of witnesses. And yet there she was, holding his eyes like she meant exactly what she said, before turning on her heel and walking back toward her office, as if nothing had happened at all, her heels striking the marble floor in that same unhurried rhythm she used for everything. By the time Ryan made it back to his desk on the 14th floor, the clip was already circulating. Someone had cropped it, added a caption, and dropped it into the company's internal chat under a channel meant for project updates. "When the boss actually likes you back," the caption read, followed by 3 laughing emojis. And within 20 minutes, 47 replies. Ryan stared at his phone screen with the particular horror of a man who had spent the last 3 years building a reputation as the quiet, reliable single dad who left the office by 5:30 sharp to pick up his daughter from daycare, and who did not under any circumstances want to become office gossip. He typed out 3 different responses and deleted all of them. He thought about walking back upstairs to explain that it had been a joke, an offhand comment, nothing that deserved 47 replies and counting. But some instinct, something quieter than embarrassment, told him that showing up in her doorway to clarify himself would only make it worse. So he closed his laptop, gathered his things, and drove to pick up Lily instead. Because 5:30 was 5:30, no matter what had happened in a conference room that morning. His co-worker Dave caught him in the parking garage before he could escape entirely, jogging up with his own laptop bag still slung over one shoulder, and a grin he clearly could not suppress. Dave had worked 2 cubicles down from Ryan for 3 years, had watched him turn down every well-meaning setup his sister and his mother had ever attempted, and had never once seen him rattled the way he looked now. He asked if it was true, if Claire Whitfield had actually said that in front of the entire floor, and when Ryan admitted it was Dave, let out a low whistle and said some men just had all the luck, which was exactly the kind of comment Ryan did not want to hear repeated anywhere near the break room. Ryan told him it meant nothing, that it was a slip of the tongue on both sides, that by tomorrow everyone would have forgotten about it in favor of some new complaint about the parking situation. Dave did not look convinced, and neither, if Ryan was honest with himself. As he pulled out of the garage, did he? Lily was waiting by the window when he pulled into the daycare lot, her backpack already on a smear of what looked like blue paint across one cheek. She barreled into his arms the second the door opened, chattering about a bird she had drawn that had, in her words, 7 wings because birds should get extra ones if they want. Ryan carried her to the car, buckled her in, and let her voice fill the space where his own thoughts had been circling all afternoon. She was 4 years old, all elbows and impossible energy, with a stubborn curl of dark hair that refused every hair tie he tried on it. He had been raising her alone since she was 8 months old, since the adoption agency handed him a folder and a diaper bag and told him this was his daughter now. Final. No further questions asked. He had never needed further questions. From the moment he held her, nothing about loving her had ever felt uncertain. What felt uncertain driving home with her voice washing over him was the echo of 3 words a woman he barely understood had said to him in front of an audience. I hope they do. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep with the picture book still open across her chest, Ryan sat at the kitchen table with a beer he did not really want and scrolled through old photos on his phone without meaning to, the way a man does when his mind is chewing on something it cannot swallow. He found himself thinking not about the video, but about the look on Claire's face in the second before she spoke, a flicker of something raw underneath all that composure, gone almost as fast as it appeared. He told himself it was nothing that powerful people said unpredictable things sometimes, just to remind everyone else who held the power, and that reading anything deeper into it was exactly the kind of mistake that got single fathers with mortgages and daycare bills into trouble they could not afford. He finished the beer, rinsed the bottle, and went to bed telling himself he would think about none of it again in the morning. A promise he broke before his alarm even went off. Across town, in an apartment on the 40th floor of a building she owned outright, Claire Whitfield sat alone with a glass of wine she had not touched and a laptop screen she had not closed. She had watched the clip herself twice after her assistant sent it to her with an apologetic note that it had gotten out before anyone could take it down. She was not angry. That surprised her more than anything else that day. She should have been furious, should have already drafted a memo about appropriate workplace conduct, and internal communication channels should have found the employee who filmed it and had a quiet, career-ending conversation. Instead, she sat in the low light of her living room, replaying the moment Ryan Bennett's face had gone red, and felt something she had spent 11 years teaching herself not to feel. She closed the laptop and walked to the small shelf near her window where she kept exactly 1 photograph that was not related to work. A photograph nobody at the company had ever seen, of a hospital bracelet folded inside a velvet box that she had never been able to throw away. It had been 11 years since the night Claire gave birth in a private wing of a hospital her own family owned a controlling stake in, and 9 years since she had stopped asking her brother Marcus what had happened to the paperwork. She had been 26 then, unmarried, and terrified in a way she had never told anyone about, not even the man who fathered the child who had disappeared from her life before the baby was 6 months old. Her father had handled everything with the brisk efficiency he handled every family embarrassment. And Claire, exhausted, grieving, and 26 years old with a company to run, had let him. She had been told the child was placed with a good family through a reputable agency, and she had believed it, because believing anything else would have broken something in her she could not afford to break. She had built Whitfield Harbor Development into a billion-dollar company in the years since, and she had never once let herself imagine what that child might look like now. Until this afternoon, when Ryan Bennett had shown her a photo on his phone during a budget meeting, laughing about how his daughter had colored an entire wall of her bedroom without permission. And Claire had glimpsed for less than 2 seconds a small girl with a birthmark on the inside of her left wrist shaped exactly like the one Claire's own mother had carried her entire life. She had said nothing in that moment. She had smiled, the polite, closed smile she used for every photo any employee ever showed her, and moved the meeting forward as if her pulse had not tripled in speed. It was only afterward, walking back to her office with Ryan 2 steps behind her, that the joke had slipped out of him, and the truth had slipped out of her before she could stop it. A small, unguarded confession, disguised as flirtation, because flirtation was easier to explain than the real reason her chest had gone tight. I hope they do. She had meant something else entirely by it, something closer to, I hope I get to see that mark again. Something closer to, I hope I am wrong about what I think I saw. And something underneath all of it that she refused to name, even to herself. She poured the wine down the sink, untouched, and sat with the velvet box open in her lap for a long time, running her thumb over the edge of the faded hospital bracelet, before she finally reached for her phone and dialed a number she had saved 3 years ago and never once used. A private investigator whose card she kept for exactly this kind of moment she had always hoped would never come. The investigator, a woman named Teresa, who had handled 2 prior matters for the Whitfield family with absolute discretion, answered on the second ring despite the late hour, and Claire found herself speaking in careful, measured sentences, even as her hands trembled faintly around the phone. She did not say the words out loud, not fully, not yet. She said only that she needed information verified about a child's adoption record, a birthmark, a timeline that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. And she asked Teresa to move quietly, discreetly, without alerting anyone at the agency or within her own family. Teresa agreed without asking the obvious questions, the ones Claire was grateful she did not have to answer aloud at midnight with her voice already unsteady. When the call ended, Claire sat in the dark long after the screen went black, staring at nothing, feeling for the first time in over a decade that the careful architecture of her life had a crack running straight through its foundation, and that crack had a name, now spelled out in a company directory 2 floors below her own office. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the office 15 minutes early, hoping to slip in before the gossip caught fire again, only to find a message waiting in his inbox from Claire Whitfield's assistant. The subject line read, Project Reassignment, and the body was brief, professional, giving no indication that anything unusual had happened the day before. He had been reassigned to lead the redesign of the Whitfield Family Foundation's Community Housing Initiative, a project that would require direct weekly meetings with Claire herself. Ryan read the email 3 times, searching for some hidden meaning in its careful corporate language, and found none. It could have been coincidence. It could have been punishment disguised as promotion, a way to keep him close enough to control the narrative before it spread further. Or it could have been something else, something he did not yet have language for. A decision made by a woman who 2 days ago would not have known his last name outside of an org chart, and who now seemed to want him exactly where she could see him. He almost said no. He drafted a reply explaining that he had a full plate already, that someone else on the team would be a better fit, that he needed to focus on projects that did not require him to be in a room with a woman who had looked at him like that in front of half the office. He deleted that message too, because underneath the panic of the last 24 hours was a small, inconvenient truth he did not want to examine too closely, which was that when Claire Whitfield had said, "I hope they do something," in his chest had answered before his better judgment could intervene. He had a daughter to protect, a reputation to keep steady, and exactly 0 interest in becoming entangled with the CEO of the company that paid his mortgage. But he typed a single word in reply, accepted, and sent it before he could talk himself out of it. And somewhere on the 40th floor of an apartment with 1 hidden photograph, Claire Whitfield exhaled for what felt like the first time in 11 years. already dreading and craving in equal measure the moment she would have to sit across a conference table from him again. That evening, Marcus paid an unannounced visit to Teresa's office downtown, a detail Teresa reported to Claire the following morning with the flat, professional caution of someone who had been in this business long enough to recognize when a client's family member was testing the boundaries of confidentiality. Marcus had not asked directly about the investigation, Teresa explained, careful not to expose his own hand too soon. Instead, he had framed his visit as concern for the Foundation's general record-keeping practices, mentioning almost in passing that older adoption files sometimes contained clerical inconsistencies that could embarrass the family if mishandled by outside parties. Teresa had given him nothing, citing client confidentiality with the same unshakable calm she used with everyone. But she told Claire afterward that Marcus's visit had not felt like idle curiosity. It had felt like a man trying to determine how much ground he had already lost, and how quickly he needed to move to protect whatever remained buried. Claire absorbed this information, standing in her kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, feeling the walls of the situation narrow further around her. If Marcus was already worried enough to approach Teresa directly, then he understood at least in outline what Claire was beginning to piece together, which meant the 11 years of careful family silence around her pregnancy had not been an accident of grief and bureaucracy. It had been maintained actively by someone who had access to exactly the tools required to make an inconvenient child disappear into a paperwork trail that led nowhere. She thought about calling him directly, laying every card on the table, demanding an explanation before she let this go any further. But some instinct, sharpened by years of corporate maneuvering, told her that confronting Marcus too early, without proof solid enough to survive his inevitable denials, would only give him time to bury whatever remained of the truth deeper than she could dig it out again. She needed the original documentation, the actual signature on the actual form, before she said a single word to her brother about what she suspected. She called Teresa back within the hour and asked her to push harder to trace the shell entity's paperwork trail as far back as it would go, regardless of what it cost or how many favors it required calling in. Teresa warned her gently that pursuing this further would eventually mean requesting access to sealed hospital records from the very private wing the Whitfield family had once controlled. Records that would require either a court order or someone with enough institutional leverage to bypass one quietly. Claire understood immediately what that meant. It meant she herself would eventually need to walk into that hospital, into the private wing bearing her own family's name carved into a brass plaque by the entrance, and ask questions about a birth that everyone around her had spent over a decade pretending had never produced any loose threads at all. At the office, the housing project moved forward with a momentum that gave Claire and Ryan legitimate reasons to spend increasing amounts of time together. Reasons that satisfied the board, satisfied the gossip mill, and satisfied Claire, admitted to herself in rare, unguarded moments, something in her that had nothing to do with either. Ryan noticed the shift in her too, though he could not name it precisely. She had grown quieter around him in a way that felt less like distance and more like restraint, as though she were holding back words that pressed against the inside of her teeth every time they spoke. He caught her staring at him once, mid-sentence during a walkthrough of the second building's framing, her expression soft in a way that had nothing to do with construction schedules. And when he asked if something was wrong, she blinked, recovered instantly, and asked him a technical question about load-bearing walls that had absolutely nothing to do with what her face had been doing seconds before. He told himself driving home that evening that he needed to stop reading meaning into every glance, every pause, every unexpected softness in her voice when she asked about Lily. He had built a careful, stable life for his daughter, one without the complications of relationships that ended badly and left a 4-year-old confused about who might disappear next. He had watched enough of his own friends navigate messy divorces and worse breakups to know that stability mattered more than chemistry, no matter how undeniable that chemistry seemed to be with a woman who ran one of the largest development firms on the East Coast. And yet, when Lily asked him that same week, apropos of nothing while eating dinner, whether the pretty lady from his work would ever come visit their house, Ryan found himself answering honestly that he did not know, but that he would not mind if she did a confession that surprised him more than it seemed to surprise his daughter, who simply nodded and returned to her macaroni as though the matter had been settled to her satisfaction. The following Wednesday, Claire found an excuse to visit the community center adjacent to the housing project site, ostensibly to review programming plans for the completed development, and arrived to find Ryan there unexpectedly, having brought Lily along after a daycare closure left him without coverage for the afternoon. Lily spotted Claire before either adult could manage the introduction properly, marching directly up to her with the fearless confidence particular to 4-year-olds, and announcing that she liked her shoes, which were, in Lily's expert opinion, the color of grape juice but fancier. Claire crouched down to Lily's eye level, something Ryan had never seen her do with anyone in the office, and asked Lily with genuine seriousness whether grape juice or fancy grape juice was better, prompting a lengthy, passionate explanation from Lily about the superior qualities of fancy grape juice that Claire listened to with an attentiveness that made Ryan's chest ache in a way he did not have time to examine before Lily reached out and took Claire's hand to show her a drawing taped to the community center wall. It was in that moment, watching Claire's fingers close gently around his daughter's small hand, that Ryan noticed the birthmark on the inside of Lily's wrist catch the afternoon light. And noticed, too, the way Claire's entire body went suddenly unnaturally still, her breath catching audibly enough that Ryan glanced over in concern. She recovered quickly, complimenting the drawing Lily pointed to with exaggerated enthusiasm. But Ryan filed the reaction away without understanding it, chalking it up to some private thought that had nothing to do with either of them. He did not know, could not have known, that Claire had just confirmed with her own eyes the shape and placement of a mark she had spent 11 years trying and failing to forget. A mark identical to the one on her mother's wrist in every photograph Claire had ever kept. A mark that told her more certainly than any document Teresa could uncover exactly whose daughter she was looking at. Claire left the community center 20 minutes later with her composure fully restored on the surface and entirely shattered underneath it. Driving 3 blocks before she had to pull over, hands trembling too badly against the wheel to continue safely. She sat there for a long time, watching people pass on the sidewalk with the ordinary, unhurried rhythm of a Wednesday afternoon, feeling the enormity of what she now knew settle over her like something physical. Lily was hers, not in the abstract, theoretical way she had allowed herself to consider over the past week, guarding against hope in case the evidence dissolved into coincidence, but in the absolute, undeniable way that came from seeing her own mother's birthmark on a 4-year-old's wrist, and knowing without any remaining room for doubt exactly what her brother had done 11 years ago, and exactly what it would cost everyone involved once the truth came out. She did not go home that night. She drove instead to the hospital, to the private wing with the brass plaque bearing her family's name, and sat in her car in the parking garage for nearly an hour before finally going inside and requesting, with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone whose name was literally engraved on the building, access to records from a delivery that had taken place 11 years earlier. The administrator on duty hesitated, citing privacy protocols, until Claire produced identification and mentioned without raising her voice that she was the patient in question and had every legal right to her own medical history. It took most of the evening and several increasingly uncomfortable phone calls to supervisors before anyone located a file that should have been simple to find, a file that, when it finally arrived, contained a discharge summary listing an infant transfer authorization signed not by any agency representative, but by Marcus Whitfield himself. dated 3 days before Claire had been told the adoption process had even begun. She sat with that piece of paper for a long time in a quiet corridor of the hospital her family had built, feeling something inside her that had been held together by grief and denial for over a decade finally give way entirely. Her brother had not simply managed an unfortunate situation with the discretion their father demanded. He had orchestrated it personally, deliberately rooting her daughter into the life of a stranger through channels he controlled directly, and had spent 11 years afterward reassuring Claire with vague, comforting lies about agencies and good families and processes that had in fact never involved any outside agency at all. She thought about calling him immediately, about driving straight to his house and demanding an explanation before she lost her nerve. But instead she folded the document carefully, slid it into her bag, and drove home in silence, understanding that whatever came next would not simply reshape her relationship with her brother. It would reshape everything, including the fragile, unnamed thing growing between her and the man who had unknowingly raised her daughter with more love and steadiness than Claire's own family had ever managed to offer either of them. Claire did not sleep at all the night she read Marcus's signature on that discharge form, and by the time morning light filtered through her apartment windows, she had made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the only path left open to her. She would not confront Marcus yet. She would not tell Ryan yet either, though the urge to drive to his apartment at 3 in the morning and simply say everything out loud had crossed her mind more than once during the long hours she spent staring at the ceiling. What she needed first was certainty solid enough to survive whatever Marcus tried to construct once he realized she knew. And certainty in her experience came only from documentation nobody could later claim had been misplaced or misunderstood. She called Teresa again before 7, asked her to cross-reference the discharge form against the shell company's financial records from that period, and then showered, dressed, and went to the office as though nothing in her carefully ordered world had shifted at all. Because falling apart in front of people who worked for her was a luxury she had never once permitted herself. The weekly project meeting with Ryan that morning nearly undid her composure within the first 5 minutes. He arrived with sketches for the community center's expanded playground, talking animatedly about sight lines and safety surfacing, and Claire found herself watching his hands move across the drawings instead of listening to a single word he said, thinking instead about how those same hands had tucked a 4-year-old's hair behind her ear at the community center, how gently and instinctively he had done it, without seeming to notice himself doing it at all. She caught herself imagining, briefly and painfully, a version of this meeting where she could simply say the truth out loud, where the three of them could exist together without the architecture of lies her own family had built around them. She pulled herself back into the room only when Ryan repeated a question about drainage specifications for the second time, looking at her with the faint confusion of a man who suspected he had lost her attention, but could not guess why. "Sorry," she said, and the apology came out smaller than she intended, stripped of its usual polish. "Long night. Go ahead." Ryan studied her for a moment longer than the explanation warranted, something like concern flickering across his face, before he visibly decided not to push. He finished walking her through the drainage plan, and when the meeting ended, he lingered at the door instead of leaving immediately, asking, with the careful casualness of someone testing whether a question would be welcome, if she was doing all right. Claire told him she was fine, that foundation work simply came with unpredictable stress some weeks, and watched him accept the lie with visible reluctance, clearly aware there was more beneath the surface than she was offering him. He did not press further. But before he left, he added, almost as an afterthought, that Lily had been asking about her, wanting to know if the lady with the fancy grape juice shoes would come to her upcoming preschool art show. And Claire felt something in her chest crack open at the thought of a 4-year-old including her unprompted in a small, ordinary piece of her life. She said yes before she had fully considered what saying yes would mean, and spent the rest of the day distracted by the enormity of that decision layered on top of everything else she was carrying. The art show was scheduled for the following evening, a modest affair in the daycare's multi-purpose room with construction paper banners and juice boxes lined up on a folding table. Nothing like the galas and fundraisers that made up most of Claire's social calendar, and yet she found herself more nervous preparing for it than she had been before any board meeting or shareholder call in years. She arrived deliberately a few minutes late, hoping to avoid an awkward stretch of standing alone among unfamiliar parents, and found Ryan near the back of the room, Lily's hand gripped tightly in his as she tugged him toward a wall covered in construction paper birds, each one Claire noted with a private ache sporting an improbable number of wings. Lily spotted her before Ryan did, and abandoned the bird wall entirely to launch herself at Claire's legs, announcing with tremendous pride that she had drawn a whole family of 7-winged birds, and that one of them was in fact meant to be Claire, distinguishable by purple shoes rendered in careful wobbling crayon strokes. Claire crouched down, examining the drawing with a seriousness that made Lily beam, and felt something inside her rearrange itself permanently. Some last defense she had been maintaining against the full weight of what this child meant to her, finally giving way. Ryan watched the two of them together from a few feet away, arms crossed loosely, an expression on his face that Claire could not fully read, but that made her pulse quicken regardless. And when their eyes met over Lily's head, neither one looked away for several long seconds, the noise of the crowded room fading into something distant and unimportant around them. They ended up outside afterward, in the small fenced play yard behind the daycare, while Lily ran laps around a swing set with 2 other children from her class, her laughter carrying easily through the cool evening air. Ryan leaned against the fence beside Claire, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all, content in a silence that felt entirely unlike the guarded silences Claire maintained in every other part of her life. It was Ryan who finally spoke, admitting quietly that he had not expected to feel this comfortable around anyone new in a very long time. That he had built his life carefully around Lily, and had not left much room in it for complications, and that whatever was happening between them felt less like a complication than he had braced himself for. Claire listened to him with her heart pounding, aware of exactly how much he did not know, exactly how much weight rested underneath every word she might say back to him, and found herself answering with more honesty than she had planned to allow herself that evening. "I don't think I've felt this comfortable with anyone either," she said, watching Lily chase after a soccer ball with fierce, joyful determination. "Which terrifies me a little, if I'm honest." Ryan turned to look at her fully, then something warm and searching in his expression, and asked gently, what exactly terrified her about it. Claire almost told him everything in that moment. The words rose in her throat, fully formed, ready to spill out into the cool evening air between them. But Lily chose that exact instant to come barreling back toward them, breathless and triumphant about having scored an imaginary goal. And the moment dissolved into something lighter, something Claire was not yet ready to shatter with a truth this large. She smiled instead, told Ryan it was simply a lot of change happening quickly, and let him accept that smaller, safer explanation, hating herself slightly for the omission, even as relief washed through her at having escaped the conversation for one more night. 2 days later, Teresa called with the confirmation Claire had been both dreading and needing. The financial records tracing the shell company's operations during the relevant period showed a pattern of transfers originating from an account Marcus controlled personally, transfers that corresponded almost exactly to administrative costs typically associated with private adoption placements, disguised within the Foundation's broader charitable expenditure reports as miscellaneous community outreach spending. It was not, Teresa explained carefully, an accident of bad bookkeeping. Someone had gone to considerable effort to obscure the money trail, layering it through enough intermediary accounts that a casual audit would never have flagged it. Which meant whoever orchestrated this had understood exactly how illegal and how damaging the full truth would be if it ever surfaced. Claire absorbed this information standing in her office with the door closed, feeling less shock now than a kind of exhausted, grim confirmation, the last remaining piece of doubt finally extinguished. She confronted Marcus that evening, not with a plan or a script, but with the folder of evidence Teresa had assembled, clutched in her hand as she walked unannounced into his home office, waving away his housekeeper's offer to announce her properly. Marcus looked up from his desk with mild surprise that shifted quickly into something more guarded when he saw her expression. And Claire, without preamble, set the discharge form and the financial records down in front of him and asked him, in a voice she barely recognized as her own, to explain exactly what he had done 11 years ago. Marcus stared at the documents for a long moment, his face cycling through several expressions before settling into something resembling resignation. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the smooth deflection he had used with her for over a decade. He told her the truth then, or a version of it, shaped carefully to minimize his own culpability, explaining that their father had panicked at the possibility of an unmarried heiress giving birth to a child with no clear paternal claim. Worried about scandal, about shareholder confidence, about the family's carefully cultivated image ahead of a critical merger negotiation happening that same year. Marcus claimed he had only been following their father's explicit instructions, that he had genuinely believed at the time that placing the child quietly and quickly with a stable, vetted family was the kindest option available given the circumstances, and that he had chosen Ryan specifically because background checks showed him to be steady, financially secure, and entirely unconnected to the Whitfield family's social circles, ensuring the child would never accidentally cross paths with anyone who might recognize a resemblance or ask uncomfortable questions. Claire listened to this explanation with a fury building slowly beneath her ribs. Quiet and controlled on the surface, but threatening to consume everything underneath. She asked him, voice shaking now, despite her efforts to keep it level, why he had continued lying to her for 11 years afterward, long after their father's death, long after any merger or scandal risk had become irrelevant, long after Claire had built an entire company and could have handled whatever truth he chose to give her. Marcus had no good answer for that. Only a mumbled admission that by the time enough time had passed to make confession feel possible, it had also come to feel unnecessary. That he had told himself the child was better off not knowing, that Claire was better off not knowing, that some secrets, once buried deeply enough, seemed kinder left in the ground. Claire told him with a coldness that surprised even her, that he did not get to decide what was kinder for a child he had never once checked on in 11 years, and that the only kindness left available to any of them now was the truth delivered honestly, regardless of what it cost the family name he had spent his entire life protecting. She left his house without waiting for a response, driving aimlessly through the city for nearly an hour, before finding herself parked outside Ryan's apartment building, staring up at the lit window where she knew Lily's bedroom was, wondering how she would ever find the words to explain any of this to the man inside without destroying the fragile, precious thing that had begun growing between them over these past weeks. She did not go up that night. She sat in her car until the light in Lily's window went dark, until Ryan's own window dimmed sometime later, and then drove home through empty streets, carrying the full weight of a truth that would within days force its way into the open, whether she was ready for it or not, reshaping everything it touched, for better or for worse, in ways none of them could fully control once it finally surfaced.
Đang chờ bổ sung chương chưa đạt 2.700 từ. Tôi sẽ viết tiếp ngay để đạt đủ độ dài.
Marcus left alone in his study with the documents Claire had shown him spread across his desk, sat for a long time without moving, the weight of the confrontation settling over him in ways he had not anticipated when he first heard her car pull into his driveway. He had told himself for 11 years that the decision he made had been defensible, even generous, a burden he carried quietly so his sister would never have to carry the shame their father insisted would follow her otherwise. But saying the justification aloud to Claire's face, watching her expression shift from disbelief to fury to something colder and more permanent, had made the excuse sound smaller than it ever had inside his own head. He thought about calling their father's old attorney, about finding some way to control the narrative before Claire took it further. But the impulse felt hollow, even as he considered it a reflex from a version of himself that had run out of road to hide behind. He poured himself a drink he did not finish, and thought with a bitterness that surprised him about the version of his life where he had simply told Claire the truth the week she gave birth, where he had trusted her to make her own decisions about her own daughter instead of deciding for her out of some misguided calculation about mergers and shareholder confidence that in hindsight had mattered so much less than he had convinced himself at the time. He thought about Lily, a child he had engineered into existence in someone else's life, without ever once visiting her, without ever knowing the sound of her laugh or the shape of her drawings, and felt for the first time in over a decade something that resembled genuine shame rather than mere anxiety about exposure. It did not undo what he had done, but sitting alone in the dark study that had once belonged to his father, Marcus understood that whatever came next, whatever consequences Claire chose to bring down on him professionally or personally, he no longer had the will or the moral footing to fight her on it. And some small, exhausted part of him felt relief at finally setting the burden down, after carrying it silently for so long. Claire, meanwhile, spent the following day moving through her scheduled meetings with mechanical precision, her mind circling endlessly around the question of when and how to tell Ryan, aware that every day she delayed made the eventual conversation harder rather than easier. She drafted and deleted 3 separate messages to him that afternoon, each one either too clinical or too raw, neither tone feeling adequate to the magnitude of what she needed to say. She thought about asking Teresa to arrange a formal legal consultation first, to understand exactly what rights and obligations existed on all sides before she said anything that could not be walked back. But the clinical distance of that approach felt like exactly the kind of cold calculation that had caused this entire situation in the first place, and she refused to treat Ryan and Lily as a legal problem to be managed, rather than people she had come to love in ways she had not expected to allow herself. By evening, she had decided only that she needed to see them both again before she could find the courage to say anything at all. And she drove to Ryan's apartment with no plan beyond simply being near them one more time before everything changed. Ryan opened the door, looking mildly surprised, Lily's cartoon still audible from the living room behind him, and something in Claire's expression must have told him this was not a casual visit, because his own face shifted immediately into careful attentiveness. He stepped aside to let her in, asked quietly if everything was all right, and Claire, standing in the doorway of the home where her daughter had grown up, loved by a stranger who had become against every plan or expectation, someone she could not imagine losing, either felt the truth rise in her throat one more time, closer than it had ever been to finally breaking free into the open air between them. Ryan led her into the living room where the television still played some brightly colored cartoon, to an empty couch, Lily having wandered off toward her bedroom sometime in the last few minutes. He turned the volume down and gestured for Claire to sit, watching her with the particular attentiveness of a man who had learned to read distress in the small, careful movements of someone trying not to show it. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and for a moment she simply looked at him, memorizing the shape of his face in the lamplight, aware that whatever she said next would either bring them closer together in a way she had never expected, or shatter everything they had built over these past weeks beyond any repair. She had rehearsed a dozen different openings on the drive over and discarded every one of them as either too clinical or too dramatic. And now, sitting across from him with his daughter's cartoon murmuring faintly from the other room, she found herself with no opening at all, only the raw, unmanageable weight of the truth pressing against the inside of her chest. "Ryan," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if I stop partway through, I don't think I'll be able to start again." He nodded slowly, some of the warmth in his expression giving way to a wary stillness, and Claire made herself continue before her nerve failed entirely. She told him about the pregnancy 11 years earlier, about being 26 and unmarried and terrified, about her father's insistence on discretion, ahead of a merger negotiation that had, in the end, mattered far less than anyone believed at the time. She told him about her brother Marcus handling the arrangements, about being assured for over a decade that the child had been placed with a good family through a reputable agency, about believing that lie, because believing anything else would have broken something in her she could not afford to break while running a company that depended on her composure. She watched Ryan's face carefully as she spoke, watched confusion give way to something more alert, more wary, as he began to understand where the story was heading, before she said the words outright. She told him about the birthmark, about seeing it on his phone during that first budget meeting, about the sleepless nights that followed, about hiring an investigator, about the discharge form with Marcus's signature dated days before any agency had supposedly become involved. She told him, finally, with her voice breaking on the words despite every effort to keep it level, that Lily was her daughter, that Marcus had orchestrated the entire placement without her knowledge or consent, routing her own child into Ryan's life through a shell company disguised as a legitimate adoption agency, and that she had spent the last several weeks trying to find a way to tell him that did not sound exactly as monstrous as she now feared it did. Ryan sat perfectly still through all of it, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something harder that Claire recognized with a sinking dread as the early stages of anger. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched long enough that Claire could hear the cartoon still murmuring faintly down the hall, could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could hear nothing at all from Ryan for what felt like an unbearable length of time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have. "How long have you known?" he asked. And Claire told him the truth that she had suspected since the community center, since seeing the birthmark up close, and had confirmed it fully only a few days ago after obtaining the hospital records. Ryan's jaw tightened. "Weeks," he said, more to himself than to her. "You've known for weeks, and you kept coming to the site visits, kept having dinner with us, kept letting Lily get attached to you, and you said nothing." Like I said, Claire tried to explain that she had needed certainty before she said anything, that she had been terrified of destabilizing his life and Lily's over a suspicion that might have turned out to be wrong, that she had been trying to find the right way to tell him, rather than simply blurting it out and upending everything without proof. But even as she said it, she heard how it sounded, how the careful, controlled logic that had guided every decision of her adult life sounded in this moment, exactly like the kind of calculated withholding that had defined her entire family's handling of secrets for generations. Ryan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair, pacing a short distance toward the window before turning back to face her. And when he spoke again, his voice had gained an edge she had not yet heard from him in all their weeks together. "Do you understand what this looks like from where I'm sitting?" he asked. "You find out your company's engineer might be raising your biological daughter. Instead of telling me immediately, you get closer to me. You come to the site visits. You show up at the art show. You let me think this was about us when the entire time you were investigating whether my daughter was actually yours. Claire started to protest that it had never been calculated in that way, that her feelings for him had grown alongside the investigation, but entirely separate from it. But Ryan was already shaking his head, his voice rising slightly, now not quite shouting, but no longer contained either. I heard part of a phone call, he said, last week. You were talking to someone, I don't know who, and I heard you say something about needing proof before you moved forward, needing to know for certain before you did anything that couldn't be undone. I didn't understand what it meant then. I thought maybe it was about the project, some due diligence thing. But now I'm standing here wondering how much of everything between us has actually been about Lily this entire time, and whether I was ever anything more than a way to get close enough to confirm what you already suspected. The accusation landed with a force that stole Claire's breath, not because it was entirely true, but because she understood with sudden and painful clarity exactly how the timeline looked from his side of it, how every gesture of closeness she had offered him over these past weeks could be reinterpreted in light of what he now knew as calculated proximity rather than genuine affection. She tried to explain that her feelings for him were real, that they had existed independently of anything to do with Lily's parentage, that she had fallen for him as a man before she had any concrete proof about his daughter at all. But Ryan's expression had already hardened into something closed and defensive, the particular wariness of a man who had spent years protecting his small family from exactly this kind of complication, and now felt that protection had failed him from a direction he never anticipated. I need you to leave, he said finally, his voice quiet again, but with none of the warmth it had carried just an hour earlier. Claire stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, and tried one more time to explain, to slow the conversation down enough that he might hear the difference between what he suspected and what had actually happened. But Ryan had already turned away, moving toward the hallway where Lily's bedroom light spilled faintly onto the carpet, effectively ending the conversation without another word. Claire let herself out, standing in the hallway outside his apartment for a long moment before she could make her legs carry her toward the elevator, feeling something inside her collapse that she had not fully realized was holding her together until it gave way entirely. She did not sleep that night either, replaying every word of the conversation, searching for the moment she could have handled differently, the sentence she could have chosen instead that would have made the truth land as care rather than calculation. She thought about calling him, about showing up at his door again to try once more. But some exhausted, clear-eyed part of her understood that showing up again immediately would only confirm his worst suspicion, that she was a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted through persistence and pressure rather than patience. So she stayed away, sitting alone in her apartment through the long hours of the night, staring at the velvet box with its faded hospital bracelet, wondering if she had just traded one 11-year absence from her daughter's life for another. Self-inflicted this time, born not of her brother's deception, but of her own failure to tell the truth soon enough to be believed when it finally came out. Ryan, for his part, spent that same night pacing his apartment long after Lily had fallen asleep. His anger at Claire tangled inextricably with a deeper, more disorienting fear that had nothing to do with betrayal and everything to do with loss. If what Claire said was true, if Lily really was her biological daughter, placed with him through channels neither of them had chosen or consented to, then everything Ryan understood about his own family, about the foundation of his life with his daughter, had just been revealed as considerably less stable than he had believed for the past 3.5 years. He was not naive enough to think Claire's revelation changed his legal standing overnight. Adoptions, Even irregular ones carried weight and process that could not simply be undone by a discharge form and a birthmark. But the fear did not live in the legal realm. It lived in the quiet, unbearable possibility that a woman with Claire's resources, once she decided she wanted her daughter back, might find a way to make that happen, regardless of what the law technically allowed. And that Ryan, a structural engineer with a mortgage and a modest savings account, would have no meaningful way to fight her if she chose that path. He called his sister that night, the only person he trusted enough to say any of this out loud to, and spent nearly an hour on the phone explaining a situation that sounded, even to his own ears, more like a plot from one of the dramatic television shows his sister liked to watch than anything that happened to real people. His sister listened without interrupting, asked careful, practical questions about what documentation existed, about whether Claire had made any explicit claims about custody or legal action, and ultimately told him what he already suspected, but had not wanted to hear clearly stated aloud, that panicking and cutting off contact entirely might feel protective in the moment, but would likely make him look less reasonable and less cooperative if this situation ever did end up in front of a judge, and that the safer path, however much it cost him emotionally, was probably to stay measured, document everything, and consult a family law attorney before making any decisions that could not be reversed. The advice was sound, and Ryan knew it was sound even as every instinct in him screamed to simply disappear with Lily somewhere Claire and her family's resources could not easily follow to protect the small, stable life he had built for his daughter by removing her from the orbit of people who had already proven through Marcus, if not through Claire herself, that they were willing to manipulate a child's entire future to serve their own convenience. He did not act on that instinct that night, though it took considerable effort not to, sitting instead with the fear and anger circling through him, until exhaustion finally overtook both sometime near dawn, leaving him only a few hours of restless sleep before Lily woke him, cheerful and oblivious, asking if they could have pancakes. 2 days passed in tense, careful silence between them. Claire attending no site visits, sending no messages, giving Ryan exactly the space he had demanded, even as every day apart from him and Lily felt like its own particular form of grief layered on top of the original one she had carried for 11 years. On the 3rd day, her assistant informed her that Marcus had requested an emergency meeting with the Foundation's board, scheduling it with unusual speed, and refusing to specify the agenda beyond vague language about administrative irregularities requiring immediate board attention. Claire understood immediately what he was doing. Rather than wait for her to expose him on her own timeline, Marcus intended to control the narrative himself. Likely by framing whatever came out as an old, regrettable mistake, he was voluntarily disclosing rather than a crime Claire had uncovered and forced into the open, a maneuver designed to minimize his own consequences while simultaneously casting Claire, and by extension Ryan and Lily, as an inconvenient complication the board should help him manage quietly. She arrived at the emergency board meeting early, documentation in hand, prepared to ensure that whatever version of events reached the board that day would be the true one, rather than whatever careful, self-serving narrative Marcus had constructed overnight. The meeting that followed was tense and lasted considerably longer than scheduled, board members shifting uncomfortably as Claire laid out methodically and without raising her voice the full sequence of events 11 years ago and the financial and administrative trail Teresa had uncovered, proving Marcus's direct involvement. Marcus attempted several times to reframe the situation as an old family matter unrelated to current Foundation governance, but the board's questions grew increasingly pointed as the documentation made clear that funds meant for charitable outreach had been diverted, however long ago, to facilitate what amounted to an unauthorized, deceptive placement of a family member's child, a liability the board could not simply overlook, regardless of how much time had passed. By the end of the meeting, The board had voted to place Marcus on administrative leave from his foundation duties, pending a full independent review. A decision that effectively ended, at least for the foreseeable future, the influence and control he had wielded within the family's charitable arm for over a decade. Claire left the meeting feeling no particular satisfaction in the outcome, only a hollow, exhausted relief that the truth had finally forced its way into daylight on terms she had controlled, rather than terms Marcus had constructed to protect himself. She thought standing alone in the elevator afterward about Ryan, about Lily, about the fragile, precious things she had built with them over these past weeks that now sat in ruins because she had waited too long to tell the truth, and wondered whether anything she did next could possibly repair the damage her family's decade of silence had caused, not only to her, but to the two people she had come against every plan she had ever made for her own life, to love more than anything else in it.
Đang chờ bổ sung, chương chưa đạt 3.000 từ, tôi viết tiếp ngay để hoàn thành đủ độ dài.
That evening, as Claire sat alone in her office, long after the rest of the floor had emptied, her assistant knocked hesitantly and informed her that a reporter from a regional business publication had been calling repeatedly, asking pointed questions about an emergency board session and unspecified family matters within the Whitfield Foundation. Claire felt her stomach drop at the realization that word of the meeting, or at least the fact that something significant had occurred, had already begun leaking beyond the boardroom. Likely from someone on the board itself who saw an advantage in controlling how the story spread. She understood immediately that she now faced a second front in this crisis, one where the private, painful truth of her family's decade-old secret risked becoming public spectacle before she had any chance to make things right with the people the secret had actually harmed. She instructed her assistant to say nothing to the press for now, to deflect every inquiry with a standard no comment, and sat afterward, turning over the uncomfortable knowledge that time, which had already run out on her ability to tell Ryan the truth before he heard rumors of it elsewhere, had now run out entirely. She drafted a statement that night anyway, not for the press, but for herself. An attempt to organize the chaos of the past several weeks into something coherent enough to explain to Ryan if he ever gave her the chance again. She wrote about the years of silence, about the specific corrosive way grief and trust had allowed her to accept her family's lies without questioning them, about the moment she first saw the birthmark and felt her carefully built life crack open along a fault line she had not known existed. She wrote, too, about Ryan himself, about how her feelings for him had grown in a direction she had never planned or controlled, entirely separate from whatever suspicion she carried about Lily's parentage, and about how desperately she wished she had trusted him enough to say all of this the moment she first suspected it, rather than waiting until certainty forced her hand and made the timing look from his side of it like calculation rather than care. She did not send him the letter that night, but she kept it folded inside the same drawer where she kept the velvet box and its faded hospital bracelet, two fragments of the same unfinished story waiting for the courage to bring them together. Ryan, meanwhile, received a call the following morning from a colleague, warning him in the careful tone of someone delivering unwelcome news that rumors were already spreading through parts of the company about some kind of scandal involving the Whitfield family and an old adoption case. Rumors vague enough that no names beyond Marcus's had surfaced yet, but specific enough that Ryan's stomach turned cold at the realization that his private life and Lily's might soon become public knowledge, shared and speculated on by strangers, with no understanding of what any of it actually meant for a 4-year-old girl who deserved better than to become office gossip twice in the same month. He hung up the phone and sat very still at his kitchen table, listening to Lily humming to herself in the next room as she colored, and felt for the first time since Claire's revelation 3 nights earlier a shift in his anger that surprised him, a recognition that whatever came next would affect Lily far more directly than it would affect him, and that protecting her now meant something more complicated than simply staying away from the woman who claimed to be her mother. Ryan spent the better part of that morning turning over the phone call from his colleague, watching Lily color at the kitchen table, with the particular absorbed concentration she brought to everything, and felt the ground shifting beneath a decision he had not realized he needed to make until the words formed clearly in his mind, that whatever anger he still carried toward Claire, however justified it felt, could not be allowed to dictate what happened next. If the truth was about to become public knowledge, whether any of them wanted it to or not. He thought about the years he had spent building a quiet, stable life around his daughter, protecting her from every unnecessary complication, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physically uncomfortable that the complication currently threatening that stability was not something he could simply wait out from a safe distance. Lily was going to be talked about. People were going to speculate about her parentage, about the Whitfield name, about scandal and money and blood. And Ryan realized that if he wanted any control at all over how his daughter experienced this, he needed to stop treating Claire as an adversary to be kept away and start treating her, whatever his feelings about the past few weeks, as someone whose cooperation he actually needed. He called Claire's office that afternoon, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded when her assistant put him through, and asked without preamble if she could come to his apartment that evening after Lily was asleep, because there were things they needed to discuss that could not wait any longer. Claire agreed immediately, her own voice carrying a carefulness that suggested she understood exactly how fragile this reopened door remained, and spent the hours before their meeting rehearsing again words she had already failed once to get right. When she arrived that evening, Ryan let her in without the coldness of their last conversation, but without warmth either, gesturing her toward the same couch she had sat on 3 nights earlier, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the small distance of his living room, both aware of everything unsaid pressing against the silence. "There are rumors already," Ryan said finally before Claire could speak. "People at the company know something happened with your brother. It's only a matter of time before someone connects it to Lily if they haven't already started guessing." Claire nodded, telling him about the reporter calling her office about the board meeting about Marcus's administrative leave, watching Ryan's expression carefully as she spoke, unsure whether any of this would land as reassurance or simply confirm how far beyond his control the situation had already grown. Ryan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked the question that had been sitting at the center of his fear since the phone call that morning, the question he had been almost too afraid to voice aloud. "What do you want to happen? To Lily, I mean. Long term. I need to know what you actually want, not what you're careful enough to say you want." Claire took a long breath before answering, aware that this question deserved more honesty than she had managed to offer him 3 nights earlier, when fear of losing him too quickly had made her explanation sound clinical and evasive rather than true. "I don't want to take her from you," she said. "I want that understood clearly first before anything else. Whatever legal standing I might theoretically have, whatever wrong was done to both of us 11 years ago, none of that changes the fact that you are her father in every way that actually matters. I'm not interested in some custody battle that would traumatize a 4-year-old to satisfy some abstract sense of biological entitlement I have no right to claim over the life you built for her." She paused, watching relief move visibly across Ryan's face before continuing. "What I want, if you'll allow it, is simply to be present in her life honestly, as whatever role makes sense once she's old enough to understand any of this. Without secrets, without investigations, without either of us pretending to be something we're not to each other or to her." Ryan absorbed this for a long moment, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he registered that Claire was not, in fact, about to weaponize her wealth and name against the fragile stability he had built for his daughter. "And what about us?" he asked, quieter now, the question carrying weight beyond its simple phrasing. "Because I keep trying to separate what I feel for you from all of this, and I can't quite manage it. I don't know if that's fair to either of us." Claire felt her throat tighten, understanding that this was the moment she had been both dreading and hoping for since she left his apartment 3 nights earlier. The moment where honesty either repaired something or confirmed it was already too broken to fix. "I fell for you before I had any real proof about Lily," she said. "I want you to believe that, even though I understand why you might not be able to right now. But I also understand if what happened these past few weeks has changed how you see me, has made it impossible to trust that anything between us was ever separate from this. I won't ask you to simply forgive that and move forward as though nothing happened. I only want you to know that none of what I felt for you was calculated, whatever it might have looked like from where you were standing." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours, moving through anger that resurfaced and then softened through explanations that landed sometimes as excuses and sometimes as genuine insight into decisions Claire had made under grief and fear rather than malice. Through Ryan's own admission that his instinct to protect Lily by cutting Claire off entirely had been driven as much by his own fear of losing something he had not expected to want as by any rational assessment of what was actually best for his daughter. Neither of them resolved everything that night, but by the time Claire left close to midnight, something had shifted between them that felt less like reconciliation and more like the beginning of a slower, more careful rebuilding, one neither of them was willing to rush, given how much had already gone wrong from moving too fast in one direction or too slow in another. The story broke publicly 4 days later, not through the reporter who had been calling Claire's office, but through a business journal that had been independently investigating the foundation's finances for an unrelated story about charitable giving transparency among major regional donors, and stumbled in the course of that investigation onto records of Marcus's administrative leave and the vague board language surrounding it. The resulting article was careful, factual, and considerably less sensational than Claire had feared, focusing primarily on questions of foundation governance and financial oversight, rather than the deeply personal family story underneath it. Though it did note in a single paragraph near the end that the irregularities appeared connected to a private adoption arrangement involving a member of the Whitfield family. It did not name Lily. It did not name Ryan. But Claire understood, reading it at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold, that this single careful paragraph would be enough for anyone determined to dig further to eventually connect every remaining dot, and that the window for controlling this narrative on her own terms had effectively closed. She called Ryan immediately, warning him before he could stumble across it himself, and spent that evening at his apartment discussing with the directness that would have felt impossible between them a month earlier how they intended to handle whatever attention followed. They agreed together, sitting at his kitchen table with Lily long asleep down the hall, that they would not hide, would not issue evasive denials, would not treat the situation as a scandal requiring damage control, but would instead prepare a brief, honest statement, acknowledging the facts without unnecessary detail, protecting Lily's privacy as much as possible, while refusing to let anyone else control how their story got told. Claire drafted the statement that night, with Ryan's input, both of them editing sentences back and forth across the table, and felt, watching him cross out a phrase he thought sounded too corporate, and replace it with something warmer and more direct, a small, unexpected sense of partnership neither of them had quite named yet, but both seemed to recognize forming between them regardless. The statement, when it finally went out through Claire's office the following week, generated exactly the kind of measured public interest they had hoped for, rather than the tabloid frenzy Claire had feared. It acknowledged that a family member had years earlier made decisions regarding a private adoption without full disclosure to all parties involved, that those decisions had since come to light and were being addressed through appropriate internal review, and that all individuals affected, including the child at the center of the situation, were being supported with care and privacy as this matter resolved. It did not mention Ryan by name, did not mention Lily's name at all, and framed Claire's own role, not as victim or schemer, but simply as a mother working to understand and repair a situation created without her knowledge or consent. The business press covered it for a few days with cautious interest before moving on to other stories, and within 2 weeks, the matter had largely faded from public attention, leaving behind only the private, ongoing work of 3 people learning how to build something honest out of the wreckage of 11 years of silence. Marcus's independent review concluded a month later, resulting in his permanent removal from any foundation leadership role, and a settlement brokered quietly through family attorneys that acknowledged wrongdoing without triggering the kind of criminal prosecution that would have devastated the family name entirely. A resolution Claire agreed to reluctantly, understanding that pursuing full legal consequences against her own brother would ultimately hurt Lily more than it would help anyone, and that some forms of accountability mattered more to her than punishment for its own sake. Marcus did not fight the settlement. He came to her office once near the end of the process, looking older and smaller than she remembered him, and apologized in halting, inadequate words that Claire accepted without absolution, telling him only that she hoped someday he would find a way to actually meet his niece, if Lily herself ever decided she wanted that, but that any relationship between them would happen entirely on Lily's terms once she was old enough to understand any of it, not on his. In the months that followed, Claire's relationship with Ryan rebuilt itself. Slowly, deliberately, without the rushed intensity that had characterized their earliest weeks together. Both of them choosing this time to move at a pace shaped by honesty rather than secrecy. She began spending time with Lily, not as a mysterious occasional presence, but as someone gradually woven into the ordinary rhythm of the child's life. Present at bath time some evenings, present at the grocery store on Saturday mornings, present in the small, unglamorous accumulation of moments that actually built a relationship rather than performed one. Lily, for her part, absorbed Claire's growing presence with the effortless adaptability of a 4-year-old who had never needed the adults in her life to explain every complicated adult reason behind why someone she liked kept showing up more often. Simply delighted that the lady with the fancy grape juice shoes now sometimes stayed for dinner, and always, without exception, admired her latest 7-winged bird drawings with total sincerity. It was nearly 6 months after that first fateful comment in the elevator corridor that Ryan finally sat Lily down one evening with Claire present and explained in careful, age-appropriate language they had spent weeks preparing together that Claire was her birth mother. That a long time ago some grown-ups had made a mistake and kept that a secret, but that the secret was over now, and there was nothing scary or bad about the truth. Only more love than Lily had realized she had all along. Lily considered this information with the same serious, unhurried attention she gave to important matters, like the correct number of wings a bird should have. Looked between Ryan and Claire for a long moment, and then asked with an entirely practical 4-year-old's priorities whether this meant she got 2 Christmases now instead of 1. Both adults laughed, relief flooding through the tension that had built for weeks around this conversation, and Ryan told her that yes, it absolutely meant 2 Christmases, at which point Lily declared the arrangement excellent and returned to her drawing as though the matter had been settled to her complete satisfaction, leaving Claire fighting back tears at the ease with which her daughter had simply made room in her heart for one more person who loved her. Claire returned to the office the following morning, lighter than she had felt in months. walking past the conference room where half a year earlier, an offhand joke had cracked open a life she had spent over a decade keeping carefully, painfully sealed. She thought about that morning often in the months that followed, about how close she had come to letting the moment pass entirely, to laughing off Ryan's joke with some polished, deflecting response instead of the honest, unguarded words that had actually left her mouth. She understood now that some part of her, even then exhausted by years of controlled silence, had been waiting for exactly that unplanned crack in her own composure, waiting for someone to catch her off guard enough that the truth she had buried so deeply might finally have a chance to surface. On a Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after that first conversation in the elevator corridor, Ryan proposed to Claire in the small fenced play yard behind Lily's old daycare, the same place where they had first spoken honestly about how comfortable they felt with each other, with Lily, now 5 and considerably taller, standing beside them, holding a ring box she had been entrusted to carry with tremendous self-important seriousness. Claire said yes before he had even finished the question, properly laughing through unexpected tears as Lily cheered and demanded to know if this meant she got to be a flower girl, a role she pursued with the same intense dedication she brought to every important project in her small, expanding life. Their wedding 6 months later was small and private, held in the same community center where Lily's art show banners had once hung, deliberately unglamorous by Whitfield family standards, attended by the people who actually mattered, rather than the wide social circle Claire's position might have demanded. With Marcus notably absent by mutual, unspoken agreement, though he sent through his attorney a modest gift and a card that Claire kept without responding to, uncertain whether that particular door would ever fully open again, but no longer angry enough to slam it shut on principle alone. Standing at the front of that small gathering, watching Ryan wait for her, with Lily beside him in a purple dress she had insisted matched her favorite shoes exactly, Claire thought about the 11 years she had spent believing she would never know what happened to her daughter, about the careful, controlled life she had built around that grief without ever fully naming it, even to herself, and felt, walking toward the two people who had become her family through the strangest, most improbable sequence of events imaginable, that the joke which started all of this had turned out against every reasonable expectation to be the truest thing anyone had said to her in over a decade. She reached them, took Ryan's hand, and glanced down at Lily, who beamed up at both of them with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had simply gotten through no calculation or plan of her own, exactly the family she deserved all along. One built finally on honesty, rather than secrets, on love chosen deliberately, rather than hidden away out of fear. Later that evening, after the small reception had wound down and Lily had fallen asleep in a folding chair clutching a fistful of leftover cake, Ryan found Claire standing alone near the same fence where he had proposed, looking out at the darkened play yard with an expression he had come to recognize as her quiet, private happiness, the kind she rarely let show fully, even now, months into trusting him with the parts of herself she had spent years keeping carefully hidden. He came up beside her, echoing the same easy silence they had first shared in this exact spot a year earlier, and asked, half joking, half genuinely curious, whether she had any regrets about how any of it had started, about the joke that had upended both their lives in front of 47 witnesses, and a company chat channel neither of them would ever quite live down. Claire considered the question seriously, watching a light breeze move through the leaves overhead, and told him with a small, unguarded smile that had become easier and easier for her to offer since the day everything came into the open, that if she had known, standing in that conference room, exactly what saying those 3 words out loud would eventually cost her, and eventually give her in return, she would have said them again without a moment's hesitation. Because some truths, however frightening, were always worth the price of finally speaking them aloud.
Đang chờ bổ sung. Chương chưa đạt 3.900 từ. Tôi viết tiếp ngay để hoàn thành đủ độ dài cuối cùng.
In the weeks following the wedding, Claire made a quiet, deliberate change to how she ran the foundation, restructuring its governance to include independent oversight that would make it far more difficult for any single family member to ever again wield the kind of unchecked administrative control Marcus had exploited for over a decade. She did this not out of lingering anger, though some of that remained, but out of a conviction that had grown steadily throughout the past year, that the secrecy which had cost her 11 years with her daughter had thrived precisely because too much power had rested in too few hands, protected by a family culture that valued image over honesty at almost every turn. She brought Ryan in informally at first, and then in an official advisory capacity to help design the new housing initiatives the foundation would prioritize going forward, work that mattered to both of them, not because it repaired the past, but because it gave shape to the kind of future they wanted to build together. One where the family name stood for something more substantial than carefully guarded appearances. Lily grew in the years that followed into a child who knew her own complicated origin story, not as a source of shame or confusion, but as simply one more thread in the larger, richer fabric of a family that included a father who had raised her with unwavering steadiness from her very first days, a mother who had fought to reclaim a place in her life once the truth finally surfaced, and eventually a younger half-brother born 2 years after the wedding, who arrived to a household already practiced in the particular hard-won art of choosing honesty over easier silences. Claire told her children the truth about their family as they grew old enough to understand more of it. Not all at once, but in careful, age-appropriate layers, determined that neither of them would ever have to discover the way she once had, that the people who loved them had been managing their entire understanding of reality without their knowledge or consent. On quiet evenings, long after the drama of that first year had settled into the comfortable, ordinary rhythm of an established family, Claire sometimes found herself thinking back to the exact moment in the elevator corridor when Ryan's joke had first cracked open everything she had spent so long keeping carefully sealed. She understood now with the clarity that only distance and healing could provide, that the words themselves had mattered less than her own unguarded, honest response to them. The small crack in her composure that had let something true slip out before her carefully trained instincts could smooth it back over into something safer and more deniable. It had frightened her at the time, that unplanned honesty, the way it had exposed feelings she was not prepared to examine in front of an audience. But sitting now in the home she and Ryan had built together, listening to Lily argue cheerfully with her younger brother over whose turn it was to choose the bedtime story, Claire understood that the fear had been worth enduring, that some of the most important truths in a life only ever arrived by accident, slipping free in an unguarded moment before anyone had the chance to talk themselves out of feeling them at all.